Okay, so now it's time to have a look at section 2 of the syllabus, which starts off with visual communication involves the eye registering changes in the environment. So we've looked at communication and stimulus response, and now we're going to start looking specifically at the eye. So starting off with the first dot point, identify the limited range of wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum detected by humans and compare this range with those of other vertebrates and invertebrates. So obviously the first thing we need to do is get our head around what the electromagnetic spectrum is and have a look at wavelengths again and see what all this means before actually having a look at the different wavelengths that are detected by different organisms. So what we have here is the electromagnetic spectrum. So electromagnetic radiation is made up of a large group of radiation waves that all travel at the same speed, which is about 300,000 kilometers per second. The difference is they have different wavelengths. So as we can see here in our low frequency, so our power lines, AM radio, FM radio, these ones have a long wavelength moving towards a very short wavelength. So wavelength determines the frequency. So if there's a long wavelength, there's a low frequency. If there's a short wavelength, there's a high frequency. And we'll have a look at what wavelength and frequency are again in a second. So these waves are a form of energy, and most of them are not visible to the human eye. The electromagnetic spectrum shows the energy associated with changing electric and magnetic fields, hence the name electromagnetic. It includes forms of radiation such as radio waves, TV waves, microwaves, heat radiation in the form of infrared, X-rays, and also includes visible light, which is the section that's most important to us. Visible light is a small part of the electromagnetic spectrum that can be seen with the naked human eye. This visible part of the spectrum has wavelengths that can be detected by the light-sensitive cells. Remember from last section, the photoreceptors being the rods and the cones that are present in our retina on the back of our eye. It's interesting to note, however, that different wavelengths within that visible spectrum are visible to different organisms. So just because we can see a certain range of wavelengths doesn't mean all organisms can. Waves of the electromagnetic spectrum are able to travel through a vacuum. So that means if all the particles have been removed, light is still able to travel through. Sound, however, cannot. It requires a medium to be able to be transferred. When the rays of light reach a transparent substance such as glass, plastic, or even water, they can travel through it, however, they become bent or refracted, if you recall back to Year 9 science. So what we have here is a glass prism, and Isaac Newton discovered that if he passed a single beam of white light through a glass prism at a particular angle, he was able to break it up into the 7 colours of the spectrum. So this splitting of white light is what we now know or refer to as dispersion. So the colours of the rainbow, which we are familiar with, are red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, and you do need to be able to recall them in that particular order. So a way that we can do that is by using Roy G. Biv, and this forms what we know as the visible spectrum. So most humans are able to see all of these wavelengths, but studies have shown that the greatest sensitivity to light in humans is in the green range of the spectrum. So wavelength is the distance measured between two crests on a wave, okay? So two high points, or you can also measure it between two low points. But usually it's easiest to measure it between two high points. The wavelength of the electromagnetic spectrum are measured in units called nanometers, and 1 nanometer or 1,000,000 nanometers would be equal to 1 millimeter. So the wavelengths of visible light range from 380 to 760 nanometers. Light in the violet to blue part of the spectrum travels as short waves with a maximum wavelength of about 380 nanometers, and these are referred to as high energy waves. So short wavelength, high frequency, carrying lots of energy. Light in the red part of the spectrum travels as longer waves with a maximum wavelength of about 760 nanometers, which carry a lot less energy than the ones at the other end. Frequency is linked to the energy of a wave simply because if a wave has a high frequency, it's able to travel, it travels faster, and therefore the energy moves through at a much quicker rate. So waves with a shorter wavelength have a greater frequency and are therefore said to be high energy waves, whereas on the other hand, waves with a longer wavelength have a low frequency and therefore are termed low energy waves. So how do we see colour? Objects tend to absorb some wavelengths of light and reflect others. Objects appear coloured because of the light that they reflect. So as we can see here, the 7 different colours are coming from the white light that we see from the sun. 6 of those 7 colours are being absorbed by the apple, and the red is being reflected into our eyes, sends a message to our brain, and our brain goes, okay, the apple is red. When white light, however, is a little bit different. So white light is actually made up of all of the different colours of light. Black, however, is the absence of light. So if you turn the lights off, it obviously goes black because there's no light reflecting off any surfaces. So when we see an object that's white, all of the colours reflect back into our eyes. All of them are detected by our photoreceptors, and therefore we see the object as white. The way that we see different shades of different colours, different intensities, is the amount of these photoreceptors that are stimulated by the light that is reflected. So this idea of white light being the presence of all light and black being the absence of light because of either the reflection or the absorption of light leads to the reason why black cars are hotter in summer because they absorb all of the light, and white cars seem to be cooler because they reflect all the light and therefore reflect all of the associated heat that comes with that light. So over the years, the human eye has evolved to see colours in bright daylight. We are able to detect colour in the visible range of the spectrum, but have receptors that are sensitive to mainly 3 regions of the spectrum, being red, green, and blue. So this is termed trichromatic. So tri being 3, chroma being colour. So 3 colour vision. And as I said earlier, the amount that each of those different receptors are stimulated will depend on the different colours, and we'll be having a look at this in much more detail a little bit later. So the human eye is unable to detect wavelengths in the far region of the violet spectrum or wavelengths in the ultraviolet part of the electromagnetic spectrum. We are blind to wavelengths of less than 400 nanometers. That is, we cannot physically see UVA or UVB light. So they're the ones that cause us to burn when we're out in the sun. Although most living things have a visual range close to that of humans, some differences are evident, and these differences we're about to have a look at now. So in particular, honeybees are able to detect wavelengths in the ultraviolet range of the spectrum. So that is, the photoreceptor cells can detect shorter wavelengths present in the UV range in comparison to humans. So UV patterns on flowers that attract bees may have a bullseye pattern, directing the bees to the pollen and nectar in the center of the flower. There's a few pictures of this in your booklet. Honeybees, however, are unable to detect some of the longer wavelengths in the red part of the spectrum. It is thought that they see red objects as black or the absence of colour. Therefore, honeybees do not see a wider range of colours than humans, but rather a different range. So unlike humans, most bird species are able to detect light well into the ultraviolet range of the spectrum. In addition to this, birds tend to be able to detect light more efficiently in the red, so the longer wavelengths and green ranges of the spectrum. They are also able to detect light in the blue range, suggesting that they have tetrachromatic vision. So tetra meaning 4, chroma again meaning colour. And some studies on pigeons have led to suggestions of a pentachromatic vision in some birds, so therefore another wavelength range that they're able to see. It is interesting to note that the sensitivity to light in the near UV range, previously thought to only occur in insects and birds, has recently been found to be present in some reptiles. And lastly, dogs do not detect colours the same way that we do. Their eyes do not contain as wide a variety of photoreceptors as ours, so they see colours in a much more muted way, as we can see in this picture. Okay, so that's it for this dot point today, and all good.